Well, as we gather for this next module, we are having conversations around racial justice. And so, to begin the racial justice dialogue, I want to take a moment to revisit some vocabulary that may be familiar to you. And the first thing is, we cannot talk about racism, dismantling racism, finding ways to combat racism in our community without making sure that we are talking about the same thing when we say, what is racism, right? And the working best practice definition that is most common in community organizing circles and in circles of organizations that are specifically doing equity-based education and advocacy is that privilege or prejudice plus power equals racism. Let me say that one more time. Prejudice plus power equals racism. So, what is the difference between prejudice and racism? Aren't they pretty much the same thing? Well, no. So, similar words that have a slightly nuanced and different meaning is that prejudice is prejudging, making an assumption, but not just assuming what someone will do, judging it, which means we're also assigning whether it is good or bad. So making that prejudice analysis of an individual or an action means that we have made a judgment before we have observed a reason for that judgment because we prejudged. We saw the person, we heard about the person, we observed the action, didn't know why, didn't know anything about it, didn't learn more about the situation. But before it even occurred, we made a judgment about whether or not that person is good or bad, that culture, that language, that action is good or bad. And we can be prejudiced about a lot of things. Race is, or ethnicity, culture, language is very common, but we can have prejudice around multiple things. We can have prejudice about the difference between iPhone users and Android users, right? But if we have never used one device or the other, to say, well, Apple's terrible, well, Androids are trash. If we've never used one, we are making a prejudgment saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. So, prejudice is that judgment, assigning of value or worth without justification. So, isn't that the same thing as being racist? Well, we also have the power component. If we have a prejudiced viewpoint, do we also have the ability to do something about it? Right? That's where statistics, data, history come in. If for example, Latina person, an indigenous person, a Black person prejudges a white individual, they might say, well, this is what white people are like without knowing them. That's bias or assumption, right? If they then assign worth or value and say, this is what white people are like, and it's bad or it's good, now they've veered into prejudice. But if they say, this is what white people are like, and it's bad, and so therefore, I'm going to make sure they have less access or less opportunity. Now we've moved into racism. The challenge is that in America, In our current reality, there is a lot less financial opportunity, educational opportunity, governmental or law enforcement safety, less medical care support, cultural competency. So when we're talking in the equity field, we say it is possible for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals to have bias beliefs about certain groups of people. It is possible for BIPOC people to have prejudice, have beliefs about certain group of people, and to actually assign value or worth, positive or negative, to them. But what BIPOC people don't have in America is enough power to turn that bias or that prejudice into a changed level of access and opportunity for that whole group of people. So when we switch the tables, right, we have white individuals that may have a belief around what BIPOC individuals are like. That would be a bias. There may be white individuals who have a belief about what BIPOC people are like and have decided that it's bad. That is a prejudice. What we also have is enough economic ability, enough privilege and connection, generational wealth, historical precedent that when enough white people got together and decided to act on their prejudice, they were able to change the reality for BIPOC individuals, right? In American history, just a few weeks ago, we had the anniversary of the day that um, Asian American, mostly Japanese, but not exclusively, internment camps were opened on American soil. There was an assumption that Japanese or Asian American people were potentially spies, dangerous communists, part of a movement to take over America or disrupt American government. And so camps, detainment centers, or facilities were built, and people, American citizens, were taken from their homes and placed and held in these camps. That is an example of racism. A belief became a prejudice that then the power to do something about it turned into an action that caused a lack of access, opportunity, or safety for a group of people based on their race, ethnicity, or culture. That's how we get to racism. So, using that appropriate vocabulary is important because we all have bias. We can work to lessen it and eradicate it, but every one of us has bias, and every one of us has some prejudice, believing that our own way of doing things is normal, our own way of doing things is best. And so we can also work to dismantle that. But racism and ending racism, being anti racist, is about not just trying to eliminate bias and prejudice, it's about pushing back against power systems that have the ability for bias and prejudice to create a lack of safety, a harmful reality for whole groups of people. That's why we talk about racism as actually having four different types or kinds of racism. Interpersonal racism that happens between two people, institutional racism that happens in an organization, such as, um, a YWCA or an arc or a congregation. We have systemic racism that happens in larger systems that are networked. Things like healthcare, transportation, housing, legal justice, court systems. And then we also have internalized racism, the racism that happens when we have heard so much messaging that we actually take it into ourselves, begin to believe it, and act on it, even if we are the marginalized group members. So I do have a short video that I'll pause this conversational video to watch, and the link to this video for wanting to share it in the future will be in your resource pack. But while you are listening to this video around the different types of racism, I want you to think specifically about your context and community. Where do you observe interpersonal acts of racism? And how do you tend to respond? How does it feel in your body? Do you practice interruption? Do you tend to avoid or try to walk away or not be near that space? Do you want to follow up later? What are your responses, both that you do and that you wish you did, if they're different, when you observe or experience interpersonal racism? When we're thinking about institutional racism, are there any places in your own institutions that you feel there may be areas for exploration? Oh, you know what? We haven't looked at our Constitution in a while, our hiring policies, our marketing, our site audits of what spaces look like and how they're decorated. Where are there areas in a site audit or an equity audit that you could begin asking questions about your institutional policies, practices, and procedures? You don't have to solve all those today. Just ask the questions, start to develop some ideas, some spaces and places for curiosity. And when we think about systemic racism, how are your communities, your neighborhoods, your areas and spheres of influence experiencing or influenced or shaped by systemic racism? For example, in my home base for most of the last 15 years, York, Pennsylvania, we are a travel island. Trains come up from DC and Baltimore and stop at the state line. Trains come in from Philly and Lancaster and then stop in Lancaster. Come to Harrisburg and stop in Harrisburg. There is a total lack of transportation for places that are largely BIPOC filled with residents. They can't get to my county. That is by design. There is systemic racism in the urban planning around transportation to make sure that public transportation, bus systems are minimal, public transportation minimal, accessibility for jobs, for relocation, or to travel and connect for simply movement back and forth from the largest centers of culture and residence for Black and Brown people. They're cut off from being able to come into or for folks to be able to get to those areas from within my county. There were multiple, it turns out, studies and suggestions from civic planners, economic growth and development strategic plans that said, we've got to change this transportation. We need access for folks from these larger cities to be able to come in and shop and live and work in this area. And there were enough people that said, we don't want those folks coming in here and changing the makeup of our community. We want the folks who've been here forever to be the only folks here. We want things to stay that way. We do not want growth and shift and change and movement. And so we are going to not follow through on these recommendations. When I started asking questions about why transportation felt like it looked so different in my area than it did in comparable cities in the region, I started doing some research and I discovered that there was a real history of systemic racism around transportation, urban mapping, and urban planning. But if I hadn't looked at the systems in the area that affected us, that affected the people I worked with, who, if they lived in the city, when all the Walmarts, the Targets, the grocery stores with fresh food had moved out to the suburbs, and now they were trying to take a 2-hour bus trip just to get to and back from Walmart, and that was significantly impacting their quality of life. If I hadn't said, what are the systems that my people are struggling with? I would not have realized how shaped by racism a lot of my community actually was, and I wouldn't have known where to focus my advocacy. So that's my ask of you is think very specifically, what are the areas, the systems that your people name time and time again as barriers to full participation? So recognizing that there are multiple places and spaces within our communities, within our little neighborhoods, that we can spot where these giant overarching systems of racism are happening, where we can spot that these institutions, even good institutions that we love, if they are embodying in some ways white supremacy culture, because that is so normalized, prioritizing written word. And, let's actually, I have an image here that has the characteristics of white supremacy culture as an area of study. And so we can see things like either or thinking, prioritizing the written word, power hoarding around certain people, prioritizing quantity over quality, right? Talking about capitalism and how that affects what we're doing. How much can we get done and how quickly can we get it done being more important than people and process? That's part of white supremacy culture. That is not an indigenous way of thinking and caring for and stewarding resources. Even the need to be objective, listen to all sides. Well, some sides are actively hurtful, harmful, and exclusionary. And there's a lot of racism and white supremacy that hides behind, well, we need to be objective. We need to let there be space for everyone to act however they want and speak however they want. That is only an effective way of being if every person in the space knows they are safe and is safe. If there are people who are vulnerable, letting folks run about rampantly unchecked to say and live out their views without any kind of safety rails, without any kind of guards and guidelines and community agreements on those behaviors, then those who are in the minority, those who are potentially vulnerable, will be harmed. The fear of open conflict, right? The difference between niceness and kindness, right? A lot of racism is hidden in niceness, whereas kindness, actually caring for people and ensuring that individuals have what they need and are well treated in a space, these are not the same things. The prioritization of a sense of urgency. Well, we're going to do the best we can, but we got to get it done quickly. Again, what's easiest? What's most easy to resource? What's the least expensive? What are the people we already have? It's much easier to keep doing what we've already been doing than it is to do research, learning, thoughtful, intentional education, specific outreach, building connection outside of our institutions or buildings with communities who we don't have historical trust with. The sense of urgency, the sense of needing to prioritize progress, getting bigger, uh, the need to make sure that we're getting that quantity over actual quality interactions. All of these are ways that racism is allowed to flourish and thrive in our institutions. So recognizing things that are not always named as racism or as white supremacy culture, paternalism, deciding what people need without asking them, or lifting up the leadership of marginalized people. That we know better, we know about you, right? These are examples of white supremacy culture and racism at work, even if folks don't recognize that. So I will put a link in the chat and make sure you have access to that. But I'll also share some further unpacking resources on white supremacy culture for your resource packet. But it is, I think, really the next learning curve in anti-racism work, because we might know the definition of racism. We might understand that expressed racism is bad, but where is racism embedded in our corporate culture, in our office culture, in our institutional culture, where it's not based on assumptions about people of color? It's more based on the ways that we interact with each other, the ways we live and work with each other, that are based in cultural values and norms and behaviors that are not uplifting for those on the margins. And a big part of that is because people are often unaware of their own culture. What? We're not aware of our own culture? I know what my culture is. Well, and I'm sure some of you have seen this before, but the cultural iceberg, right? Are you fans of the cultural iceberg? Let me show this to you. The cultural iceberg theory is the idea that, like an iceberg in nature, only about 10% of an iceberg is actually visible, right? The rest of the iceberg is under the water. That's where real heft, reality, that which truly shapes the movement of water, what can cause icebergs to be dangerous, is often hidden. So when we think about culture, we often think about surface culture, that 10% that's easily visible. Food, flags, festivals, fashion, holidays, music, dance, games, arts and crafts, performances, literature, language. But what we call deep culture, the culture that is underneath the surface, that's where 90% of cultural norms are actually housed. Concepts of time, of fairness and justice, gender roles, appropriate age behavior, what constitutes a family, ideas around courtesy and manners, leadership and the responsibilities of a leader. What is beautiful? What is cleanliness? Attitudes towards how elders are treated. Adolescents are given responsibility. Dependents are cared for. Expectations around work, rule, authority. The importance of cooperation versus competition, relationships with animals, the idea of sin or death, right? Approaches to religion, marriage, raising children, how we make decisions, and how we solve problems. These are cultural aspects of reality. These are not human aspects of reality. Um, but because deep culture is often unseen and unnamed, it is far too easy to not recognize that we have very specific concepts of things like personal space or body language, eye contact, gestures, what kind of emotions we display, tone of voice we use, friendship, beauty standards. And so we don't recognize those as signs of culture and therefore believe that, well, the way we do things must just be the way that all humans do things. It's common sense, it's human nature. Fun fact, very little of what we say is human nature is human nature. It is cultural behavior that has been learned at such a young age, so comprehensively indoctrinated into us by our surrounding influencers that we don't even recognize it as culture. So, a big part of figuring out how to eliminate bias and dismantle cultural racism, which is institutional or systemic, is that we need to start by recognizing what is culture. So I would absolutely ask you, think about your organization, think about your institution, think about the place where you work, and then move beyond how are things decorated? What holidays do you celebrate and uplift? What languages or literature are represented? And instead, think about how do we determine acceptable personal space where desks are placed, chairs are set, people are invited to be in lines, our gathering spaces. Think about the body language that we share when presenting, our communication patterns, whether or not we display emotion. A great deal of what is considered professional or not professional is cultural, not based on what is truly professional, based on what one culture feels is professional. So, what tone of voice is appropriate? What level of emotion we are allowed to display or invited to display? How modest we need to be professional in the space, and then judging individuals who we don't see as being modest or who we might see as being too loud or too emotional or not friendly enough, not expressive enough, not relationship building enough. Those are often judgments made about who does or does not fit into the corporate culture or the institutional environment because they come from a different ethnic culture. It's not about who's professional. It's not about who is a good organizational fit. It's about our own institutional lack of cultural awareness. Where are we building ideas of time, of fairness and justice, of what are appropriate roles for leaders to take? What constitutes cleanliness? How much responsibility are we giving youth and adolescents in decision making? How are we evolving them in these processes? How are we respecting the wisdom of elders and those who have gone before, or dismissing the wisdom of those who have aged out of relevance? These are very different ways of uplifting the wisdom of young people and seniors, and different cultures have very different prioritizations of young people's wisdom or our seniors and elders' wisdom. So, realizing how much of our institutional policies and procedures are shaped by culture can help us figure out why it is that when we are trying to interact with people from other cultures, races, or backgrounds, those interactions may not be as helpful as we wish they were. And where can we find attitudes to potentially shift and change